Welcome to the fifth episode of the Are You Done series. In this simple, no nonsense, straightforward series, we aim to figure out if you are actually done with certain concepts for the upcoming civil services examination, or if you just think that you are done. The concept that we'll be testing today is going to be the President of India. I'm going to ask you a series of questions on these 6 sub areas of the president, and we will figure out how many of them you can answer. The first sub area is going to be the election framework. Then we will be doing the qualifications, oath, tenure, and removal, the executive powers, the legislative and financial powers, the veto and pardoning powers, the case laws, as well as the discretion that the President of India has. To begin with, in the election framework, I am now going to ask you certain questions, and you should be able to answer the majority of them. If you are not able to answer it, then very clearly you are not yet done, and you must revise it again. The first question is, what article talks about the electoral college of the presidential election? Secondly, who is included in this electoral college and who is excluded? Thirdly, what is the value of the votes of those who are included? Fourth, what is the voting system that is followed? Is it first past the poll system, or is it proportional representation? Fifth, is the ballot open or secret? Based on this, also tell me whether a party whip can be enforced, whether the anti-defection law can apply over here. Sixth, what is the winning quota formula? What quota system is used? Seventh, who conducts the elections? Eighth, who adjudicates or who decides disputes? Ninth, due to dissolved assemblies, can the election be postponed? Can that be a valid reason? Tenth, if the president's elections are declared void, what happens to the past acts? Now, we will also be answering the questions here, and do let me know how many of these 10 questions you were able to answer. You should have been able to answer at least 8 of them. Ideally, all 10 of them, because these are very basic. Alright, so firstly, the article is obviously Article 54. For the composition of the Electoral College, we have elected MPs and elected MLAs. So people who are therefore excluded would be the nominated members of both the parliament as well as the legislative assemblies. We also exclude people who are members of the legislative councils. Now, what is the value of the votes? Now, like I said, there are two people who are included: elected MPs and elected MLAs. So, the value of an MLA is going to be the all of the population of the state that they are a part of, divided by the total number of elected MLAs, and you multiply this with 1000. Right, sorry, by 1 by 1000. What this tells you is that as the population increases, the value of the MLA's vote also increases. But at as the number of elected MLAs in a state increase, the value of their vote decreases. For MPs, we have the total MLA value, which is the total vote value that the MLAs have, and you just divide them by the total number of elected MPs. Here you do not further divide this by 1000 like you did for the MLAs. So the interesting part that you'll figure out over here is, or what you should observe right now, is that for MPs, every single MP, whether he be from the Rajya Sabha or the Lok Sabha, whether he be from Sikkim or Uttar Pradesh, their value of vote remains the same. Whereas for MLAs, state-wise their value differs. Now, they use the proportional representation by means of single transferable vote. A common criticism here is, of course, like you just saw, not every single elector has the exact same vote. They don't have one vote. So it doesn't really fit the exact definition that way, and that becomes confusing. But we do not use the first past the poll system for the presidential election. We use between ballot of open or secret, we of course use the secret ballot, and this means that whatever vote the electors cast, that cannot be checked by their party members. So a party whip obviously cannot be enforced, and if you can't enforce a party whip, you obviously cannot have the ADL or the anti-defection law applying. The quota system here is what we call the droop system. The droop quota. What this means is that we do the valid votes divided by the number of people that we are electing, so number of seats that are there for the election, so number of seats plus 1, and this entire thing is again added with 1. Of course, there is only one president of India, so there is only one seat, so this becomes 1, so this entirely becomes 2, which ends up meaning that we need 50% plus 1 to become elected as the President of India. Now, the election is conducted by, this should have been very simple, the Election Commission, of course. The disputes are decided by the Supreme Court of India, and they have exclusive jurisdiction over here. which means only they decide. If they so decide that the election is void, what happens to the past acts? They are still valid. The election, can it be postponed because of vacancies or dissolved assemblies? The answer is no. That does not affect the sanctity of the election. We will now look at the qualifications, oath, tenure, and removal of the president. So, firstly, for qualifications, which article gives this? Secondly, what is the minimum age? Thirdly, do they have to be qualified for election or for a seat in the Lok Sabha or Rajya Sabha? How many proposers do they need? And how many seconders do they need? Where do these proposers and seconders come from? As in, who can be a proposer or a seconder? What is the security deposit amount? Where is it deposited? What happens, or on what grounds, under what circumstances do you have to forfeit this amount? Can the president hold an office of profit? Can they also be a member of parliament? Who administers the oath? What are the contents of it? Is it there in the third schedule? These contents, who else in their oath has it? Has similar contents. Okay, so we'll first answer these questions and then I'll perhaps ask you a few more questions in this sub area. So, very simply, the article here is Article 58. The minimum age is 35. They have to be qualified for Lok Sabha, not for Rajya Sabha. For the Vice President, they have to be qualified for the Rajya Sabha. There have to be 50 proposers and 50 seconders, and they are the electors who must be the proposers and seconders. The security deposit amount is 15,000. It is deposited with RBI. They have to forfeit this amount if they fail to get 1/6 of the total valid votes. Of course, the president cannot hold an office of profit. He cannot be a member of parliament. The oath is administered by the CJI, or in his absence, it is administered by the senior most judge of the Supreme Court. The contents of the oath, which are administered by the Chief Justice of India or the senior most judge, are most importantly to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. The other office that has a similar word or similar wording is the governor. Even the vice president does not have preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution in their oath. It is not available in the third schedule, this oath. Now, let's talk about the tenure of the president. So, what is the tenure of the president? How many years? Under what circumstances can they continue even after the term has ended? Are there any limits to how many times they can be re-elected? Contrast this with USA. About the vacancy, if a vacancy is created, under what timeline must it be filled? If the vacancy is due to something like death or resignation and not due to the end of the term, who becomes the immediate acting president? What if this person is also not available? Who was the first such guy who acted as president, first person who was acting president, because the uh, person who was supposed to act as the president was also not available? Sixth, what is the method of removal? Who can initiate the removal? Initiation by 8th. What kind of majority is required for the removal? Now let's also go through these answers. Out of these 8 questions, you should have at least been able to answer 7 of them. The tenure of the president is, of course, 5 years. He can continue after his term is ended, but if the successor has not yet assumed the office. His re-election limits are, well, not there, so he can be re-elected any number of times. In USA, you can only hold office twice, so you can only be elected 2 times. If there is a vacancy to be filled due to death or resignation, you have the vice president who will become the acting president, and this vice president is only an acting president for a short duration. They do not finish the term of the president as is done in USA, which means the vacancy must be filled by 6 months. And if the vice president is also not available, then it is the Chief Justice of India who must be the acting president for that duration. The first person who was the Chief Justice of India and had to act as the acting president because of a vacancy created due to the absence of both the president and the vice president was Justice Muhammad Hidayatullah. This is a very important fact for the post-independence history of our country. He is the only person who has ever been the Chief Justice, the President, and also later elected as the Vice President. Another interesting fact about him is that his brother was also the Foreign Secretary of Pakistan at one point. Since, of course, this is post-independence history, but it's a very interesting fact. Anyway, the method of removal is of course the impeachment. You have to use a formal impeachment to remove the president. This can be initiated by either house. This can only happen if there is a violation of the constitution. Now, what exactly constitutes a violation of the constitution has not been defined in the constitution. You will need a special majority to remove them. We will now look at the executive powers, the executive powers of the president. The first thing that should come to mind when I say extensive power, executive powers, is what is the extent of it? What is it co-extensive with? It should be fairly obvious. Secondly, which article governs the aid and advice portion of the president's functioning? Thirdly, is the president bound by the aid and advice? Fourth, who appoints the prime minister and the other appointments for people like or how about this? You tell me what other appointments, important appointments, are done by the president. Sixth, who allocates portfolios? And on whose advice? Seventh, who is the supreme commander of our armed forces? This should be a fairly easy one. The extent or the of the president's powers or his domain, executive domain, is coextensive with the parliament's legislative competence or legislative domain, which means he is limited to the fields that are there in the 7th schedule of the Union list and the concurrent list in his executive domain. The aid and advice is mentioned in the Article 74. The president is bound by it, as was ensured after the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act, where the word was shall act in accordance with the aid and advice. Of course, the president is the one who appoints the PM. The other appointments done by the president, they should also be fairly simple. Almost all of the important appointments are done by the president. So here you will have the ministers, the governors, the CAG, the election commissioner, the advocate general, UPSC member, the chairman members, the finance commission, and all constitutional bodies in general. Very importantly, here you should keep in mind that the RBI governor is not appointed by the president. He is appointed by the central government. The allocation of portfolios to the ministers. So, for example, who allocating home affairs to one minister, allocating external affairs to another minister, allocating, let's say, fisheries to another minister. This allocation of portfolios is done obviously by the president on the aid and advice of the prime minister. The supreme commander of the armed forces is obviously the president. Now we look at the legislative and the financial powers of the president. So, firstly, tell me who summons the parliament, who prorogues the parliament, who dissolves the Lok Sabha, who adjourns the parliament sessions. Secondly, when is a presidential address to the parliament mandatory? Thirdly, on what basis does the president nominate Rajya Sabha members? How many does he nominate? How is this different from the governor nominating members of the legislative council? So how many members does the governor nominate, and on what grounds or on what criteria? And same thing for the president. Sixth, the money bills are introduced on whose recommendation? Seventh, there are two categories of finance bills, category 1 and 2. This comes under article 1171 and this is 1173. Both of these require the president's recommendation at some stage, right? So which stages do they require such recommendation? So we'll go through these answers, then I'll ask you a few more questions. Firstly, the summoning, prorogation and the dissolution is all done by the president. The adjournments are done by the presiding officers, which means for the Lok Sabha it would be the speaker. The presidential address is mandatory after or on the first session after the general election and the first session of each year. The president can nominate 12 members to the Rajya Sabha who have the criteria of being well known in the fields of literature, science, art, or social service. For the governor, on the other hand, he nominates 1/6 of the total members of the legislative council, and he follows the exact same eligibility criteria but also cooperative movement. Which means the governor can nominate people on the basis of literature, science, art, social service, and for the contribution to the cooperative movement. Money bills are, of course, introduced after the President's recommendation. Now, finance bills category 1 and 2. For category 1, you need the President's recommendation in the introduction stage. Interestingly, for the finance bills 3, you need the recommendation for the consideration stage, not the introduction stage. So you can introduce a finance bill category 2 under 1173 without the President's recommendation, but you cannot bring it to the consideration stage without it. Alright, I hope you were able to answer most of those. I'll ask you a few more questions within this sub area. Let's start with ordinances. Now, firstly, which is the article that's important here? Which article talks about it, basically, or gives the power to the President to promulgate ordinances? What conditions are required to exist to promulgate such ordinances? Thirdly, can an ordinance amend an ordinary law? Can an ordinance amend the Constitution? Can it be retrospective? What is the validity period of an ordinance? So what is the maximum life that it can have? Also, tell me, which reports does the President cause to be laid down before the Parliament? Now, for ordinances, we'll go through the answer right now. It's Article 123. The conditions are very simply that the Parliament is not in session, which means at least one of the houses, so either the Rajya Sabha or the Lok Sabha, is not in session. Plus, there is an immediate need for the ordinance. And the President has to be satisfied that such circumstances exist which render it necessary for such immediate action, that is to promulgate the ordinance. Any ordinance by the President can of course amend any ordinary law, but it cannot amend the Constitution. It can be retrospective, just like an ordinary law. The validity period is 6 weeks from when the House reassembles again. And if you remember the basics, you should know that the maximum gap between the sessions can be 6 months. So, which effectively means that an ordinance cannot last for more than 6 months, 6 weeks at a time. The reports that the President causes to be laid down for the Parliament would be things like the budget, the annual financial statement, the CAG reports, the Finance Commission reports, the National Commission reports. Basically, all reports by constitutional bodies are laid down before the House by the President. So here you should keep your eyes and ears open, so that if somebody says, or the question says, that the reports by the PSC is caused to be laid down by the president, that would be wrong. Parliamentary committee reports are not laid down by the president. The Public Accounts Committee, for example, would not be done by him. Now let's move on to the veto and the pardoning powers of the president. Firstly, tell me, does the president have absolute veto? Does he have suspensive veto? Does he have pocket veto? Does he have qualified veto? The answer is yes, he has absolute veto, which means that he can fully reject a bill. Suspensive veto means he does have that, which means he can return it once. But if it is passed again, he must provide assent. He does have pocket veto. There are no timelines under which he must give his assent. He does not have qualified veto, which is there with the US president. Secondly, can the president return a money bill? Can he return an ordinary bill? Can he return a constitutional amendment bill? The answers are no, he cannot return a money bill because it was introduced by his recommendation anyway. An ordinary bill can be returned once by him. Constitutional amendment bills have to compulsorily be given a assent, which means no veto is possible for constitutional amendment bills. Now let's look at the pardoning powers. So I'm going to write down the types of pardonings and you must tell me the differences between them. So what is a full pardon? What is a reprieve? What is a respite? What is a remission? What is a commutation? Very simply, pardoning, a full pardon would be कि सब कुछ माफ है, so that means that the entire punishment no longer exists, everything is forgiven. Reprieve is when they're given some relaxation so as to ask for, let's say, a commutation or anything else, so that they can delay the punishment. Respite is given for reasons of compassion. So let's say a pregnant lady is sentenced to death. She can avail respite. Remission basically reduces the time in the prison. So for example, if you're sentenced for say 20 years, a remission can reduce it to 10. Commutation would change the type of punishment. So from a death sentence, you can be commuted to life imprisonment. From rigorous imprisonment, you can be commuted to simple imprisonment. Now tell me, does the president have the authority to pardon a death sentence? Can the president intervene or use his pardoning powers during court martials? Can the governor pardon a death sentence? Can the governor intervene or use his pardoning powers in court martials? Is pardoning power absolute? The answers are death sentence, the president can pardon it. The governor cannot fully pardon it, but he can, for example, commute it. Court martials, on the other hand, are exclusive to the president. The governor cannot do anything about it. Pardoning power is not absolute. Limited judicial review is possible. This important cases over here would become your Maruram and the Kehar Singh case, which spoke about how that the pardoning power does have limited judicial review, judicial scrutiny. Now, let's talk about discretion and case laws. Firstly, is there explicit constitutional discretion available to the president? Do we have situational discretions? If so, what are they? There is absolutely no explicit constitutional discretion given to the president. We do have situational discretion. So, for example, you would have during hung assemblies or a hung Lok Sabha, the president can use his discretion for the appointment of the prime minister. He can return advice tendered to him once. Now for the important case laws. Firstly, I want you to tell me about the S.R. Bomai case of 1994. So, in this, tell me that what was held during or what was held regarding the floor test. What limits were placed on the satisfaction of the president? Secondly, tell me about the Rameshwar Prasad case of 2006. Tell me, can the assembly be dissolved before the floor test? The context here is Article 356, which is President's rule. So, for applying it, can the President dissolve the state legislature before applying the floor test? Also, tell me what is a floor test. Thirdly, tell me about the Shamsher Singh versus Punjab 1974 case. Which doctrine did it invoke with respect to the president? And what does that mean? Here you should remember that about the SR Bommai case, that the floor test should be the primary method, not the governor's report about whether or not there can be a majority formed inside a legislature. The president's satisfaction is subject to limited judicial review. The Rameshwar Prasad case of 2006 told us that again, you cannot dissolve an assembly before using the floor test. The governor's report is not enough. And what is a floor test? A floor test is basically having to prove your majority on the House floor, which basically means that you pretty much have a vote of confidence to see if somebody can hold the confidence of the assembly. The Shamsher Singh case versus Punjab gave us talked about the constitutional head doctrine, which basically elaborated that the president can not act independently, and he must act by the aid and advice of the cabinet. Now we're going to look at some previous year questions that you should be able to solve after going through the Are You Done series of the president that we've done so far. Firstly, with reference to Indian polity, consider the following statements. An ordinance can amend any central act. An ordinance can abridge a fundamental right. An ordinance can come into effect from a backdate. We have gone through this. So, of course, it can amend it can amend a central act. Of course, it can come into effect from a backdate because it can be retrospective. But to abridge a fundamental right, now you need a Constitutional Amendment Act, and you cannot amend the Constitution through an ordinance, so of course you can't abridge a fundamental right. The answer is C. The Constitution of India explicitly mentions that in certain spheres, the governor of a state acts in his or her own discretion. You should know this. The President of India can, of his or own, reserve a bill passed by a state legislature for his or her consideration without it being forwarded by the governor of the state concerned. Even if you have not explicitly read this line, you should have understood by now that the president has very limited discretion. So his or her own, which basically means discretion. They are acting independently here. And since discretion is so limited, you should have assumed that, of course not. You needed to be forwarded by the governor. So this becomes wrong. The Constitution of India explicitly mentions that in certain spheres, the governor of a state can act on his or her own discretion. This is a very evident point in the Constitution. While the president does not have explicit discretion, the governor has a very clear advantage in the Constitution, although he or she must also act on the aid and advice in general. The answer here is A. Now, consider the following statements with regard to the pardoning power of the President of India. The exercise of this power by the Parliament, by the President, can be subject to limited judicial review. The President can exercise his power without the advice of the central government. Again, we just spoke about how discretion is so very limited for the President. Whatever is there is situational. There's no constitutional discretion anyway. So, of course, this is wrong. Limited judicial review. Always know that almost everything in the Constitution is subject to some form of judicial review or the other. And if it is limited, it's most definitely true. Of course. So the answer here is again A, one only. It is the governor of a state who recognizes and declares any community of that state as a scheduled tribe. A community declared as a scheduled tribe in a state need not be so in another state. This should know it is done by the central government. It is the domain of the executive power of the president, and hence it is the president who does this. If you follow news in general, you will also know that many communities face issues because they are given a scheduled tribe status in one place but not in another. So this will of course be correct. So the answer is 2 only. If the election of the President of India is declared void by the Supreme Court of India, all acts done by him or her in the performance of duties of his or her office of President before the date of decision becomes invalid. We just went through this. Election for the post of the President of India can be postponed on the grounds that some legislative assemblies have been dissolved and elections are yet to take place. We've been through this too. When a bill is presented to the President of India, the Constitution prescribes time limits within which he or she must declare his or her assent. If this were the case, then pocket veto had no meaning. We know this to be false, we've gone through it. We know this to be false, we've gone through it. So the answer is very clearly none. The members nominated to either house of the parliament or the legislative assemblies of states are also eligible to be included in the electoral college. Okay. Higher the number of elective assembly states, higher is the value of vote of each MLA of that state. The value of vote of each MLA of Madhya Pradesh is greater than that of Kerala. The value of vote of each MLA of Puducherry is higher than that of Arunachal Pradesh, because the ratio of total population to the number of elective states in Puducherry is greater as compared to Arunachal Pradesh. Let's look at the first two statements. Here, we very clearly know that the nominated members are not part of the electoral college. This is very static, we've been through it. No problem, this is wrong. So all four cannot be the answer. Higher the number of elective assembly seats, higher is the value of vote of each MLA of that state. We went through the formula. It was population divided by the number of MLAs multiplied by 1 by 1000. MLAs is in the denominator, so that means as the number of MLAs increases, the value of the vote decreases. This is of course also wrong. Now coming to, so the answer cannot also be only 3. It is either only 2 or only 1. Now very frankly, this now becomes a very difficult question to answer unless you are very precisely aware of this. You could take a guess that the population of Madhya Pradesh is much greater than that of Kerala, so they may have a stronger chance. I am assuming you wouldn't be aware of the total number of MLAs of both the states. But the answer here was that the fourth statement was correct. So only 1 was the answer. So you could eliminate 2 options based on your knowledge. Here you would have to take a guess that of these 2 statements, 1 could possibly be correct. But that is a very difficult gamble to play. I will leave that to you. Now, with reference to the election of the President of India, consider the following statements. The value of vote of each MLA varies from state to state. We have been through this. I showed you how it's different for MPs and different for MLAs. The value of vote of MPs of the Lok Sabha is more than the value of the votes of MPs for the Rajya Sabha. Again, we've been through this. We know that for all MPs, they have the exact same value of vote. So the answer is obviously A, one only. Now the last question. To the Constitution of India, it is the duty of the President of India to cause to be laid down before the Parliament. Which of the following? Now, recommendations of the Union Finance Commission. This is a constitutional body. Public Account Committee. It's not a constitutional body. It's a parliamentary committee. CAG, very important body, constitutional. The National Commissions for Scheduled Castes. So, very clear the answer becomes 1, 3, and 4. Because parliamentary committee reports are not not caused to be laid down by the President of India. And that brings us to a wrap. Thank you for your time. I hope that now you can take an informed decision about whether or not you're done with the President or whether or not you need to revise it once more. Thank you and have a great day.